but many of them were actually engaged with these kinds of agricultural practices which are not based on fossil fuels and chemicals. And you also have indigenous peoples in the forefront of forest protection and fighting the timber companies and so on. So many of our inspiration came from working from these grassroots communities. And of course, as we engaged it's not enough only to be at the local or the national, have to be at the international as well. You mentioned the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest green climate dedicated fund for climate. Some of us actually worked with the developing country governments at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change with the group of 77 in China to create that fund. And I don't like to brag, but I have to say I was one of the first developing country civil society representative on the board of the Green Climate Fund. So, no, you don't need to, I didn't say that as for deserving a clap, but only to say that when people talk about civil society and civil society engagement, we can engage at many levels, and I know a number of you are very passionate. I think the point is that how can we use our energies in whatever fields we are to be engaging in those advocacies. If we have come so far, whether it's the Green Climate Fund or even the Loss and Damage Fund, what you also mentioned, Cairo, very critical, that fund was only possible because of civil society campaigning both with the northern civil society groups, the global, we are also involved in what's called the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And we have a platform, and it's around the world, a lot of global civil society voices from the south who are particularly representing the interests of those who are vulnerable and those who have been least responsible for climate change facing the impacts. So in that Loss and Damage Fund was able to be created because of a lot of political mobilizing in the United States. So we actually engage in political mobilization. So we are not just civil society who, we take money and we plant trees, but it's really about public advocacy and so on. So the last thing I want to say is that the climate finance is absolutely critical. We know, everybody is talking about it. It's not a Malaysian challenge alone. I just wanted to respond to the morning session. I just find that we are very, mitigation-centric. And as Shaoluk and others will say, it's important to do what we have to do, but Malaysia is only contributing less than 1% to the global emissions. And what you can see happening is that the impacts that we are facing is so tremendous. We are not ready for the adaptation challenge. We are not ready for the loss and damage. And you look at the heat waves, where do we have to go? Kelantan, and not just Kelantan alone, because Topa is here, but you look at Mada, Penang is going through a water crisis. So we are facing the impacts. And I don't think we are talking enough about finance for adaptation, finance for loss and damage.
Thank you, Lina. Adrian, we worked briefly on the UK PAC program, which is the UK government's, or Malaysia's largest international climate finance investments in Malaysia. Would you like to say a little bit about REE2 and the work you do there?
Yeah, thank you, Karuna. I think it's very important to also look at the grassroots and how the real situation is being really portrayed. Because again, one of the biggest problems we have in Malaysia is like how accurate is our data is. And for example, like in Sabah, we don't even know how many actually unelectrified communities are there. And you go to different agencies, they have different figures and so on. So I think this exercise and also the research that was funded by the UK PAC is very important because it gives the actual reality on the ground where the needs are, and also what the options are to actually, for example, to electrify these communities. Because when you want to talk about transition, this community have transition to what? They have nothing. And this is something that we have to really look at and also take the opportunity to, from the right beginning, we already frame it so that it can be addressed to renewable energy, options that is much more sustainable and so on. And those are the outcome of the Sabah RE study that we have done. But in the same time, we also managed to unearth a lot of these community efforts down there that is unknown to many of us, and how innovative communities have been trying to build their own self-help sort of program to have access to electricity and water. And these are something that have been documented in the process, and these are something that my team in Tanibong have been working on for the last 25 years to develop all this community-based model that is already there. Solutions are there, but how come this sort of solution, community-based solutions, is not being given the opportunity to also be part of the options for us to move on? I think because lack of awareness about these sort of existing initiatives, but also the lack of trust from the government side to look at. It's almost like they don't believe that the community actually can do it themselves. And when we even presented to the state KPLB, they said, "Do you sure that they managed to do micro hydro? Well, how come we don't know about this?" And as I said, because you never go to the ground. And that's why. So, and then the exercise is actually really important to see that communities and civil society have already been working on sort of adaptation and solutions that is very much coming from the ground. And one of the things that really came out from that is the need for capacity building. And the problem with a lot of this is nobody wants to pay the soft cost, the software part. They want to see hardware, tangible. So a lot of the funding, especially even for corporate, they go CSR, they want to see building, they want to see pipe running, or lights going up, but they don't even invest enough on making sure that there's enough training for the operators of the system so that it can be sustained. And a lot of this time, a lot of projects failed because the lack of understanding of the dynamics of community on the grassroots level, and the lack of trust building that the community themselves can, if provided the opportunity, come up with a very robust structure of management through the ADAT system, through a lot of the, for me, because I come from an indigenous community, there's a lot of indigenous wisdom out there that can be used to actually to reduce the risk of this sort of investment. And the problem is, I can say, just reflecting from all this, is like in normal economic model, we take everything from nature, but we don't give back to nature. In indigenous values, we take what we need and we give back when we have something to offer to the community, to nature. It's always like this. Because if you don't respect nature, nature will come back with us with a hard whip on our back. So that's why we have to learn and then adopt a lot of our business way of doing things from the indigenous communities, because there's a lot of wisdom that managed to ensure the survival of these communities for millennia. And so I think it's high time that we should go back to some sort of models that is not normally mainstream, and look at some of this as a de-risking strategy for investment. So I think that is something that also came out from our study for the roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you, Bani. I think for context, the design of the financing mechanism, at least from an international climate finance perspective, was important. So one of the elements of the fund required demand from government. And the fact that you have been working on this for all these years, for 20 years, and it was the first time that there was a recognition from the government, from the Sabah government, at least the energy sector, was really critical. So the demand of the structure of financing, I think, is something that we don't think about enough in terms of progressing how finance reaches the community. And what I was particularly impressed about, at least from the RE2, and for context, the audience context, 80% of unelectrified Malaysians are in Sabah. And the work that the Forever Sabah did, particularly in consortia with Tony Bung, which is an indigenous an indigenous technology developer, as well as Pakos Trust, which had a map of where all these indigenous communities were particularly impressive. So it was we were very proud to have that on our portfolio of finance, but we'd love to hear more about that. But before that, perhaps we could hear from you, Fatin, and the work that you do with nature and young people.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Karen. So first of all, I would like to kind of maybe point the elephant in the room that, I feel very humbled sitting here with all these veterans many years ahead of me. So I feel like I'm learning from them as much as you all in the audience as well. Okay, so back to my work. So I am from WWF, but unlike Mina and Bunny here, I don't really work on the ground. So my role in WWF is within sustainable finance, and we work to advocate within the financial sector, and we have a two-pronged strategies, right? So the first strategy, which we have actually worked very closely, Karen, I think 2 years ago, was to how we can transform the financial system, right? So meaning how do we advocate climate, biodiversity, and social human rights related issues within the system? How do you bring in the awareness? How do you bring in the technical skills to equate them, to prepare them for the change to come ahead? And another strategy is something that we are becoming more and more involved in, and something that has really humbled me, keep me grounded in my work in WWF, is that how do we try to channel or enable more financing towards conservation and nature projects. And with that, I've actually visited a lot of sites, conservation sites in WWF Malaysia, and with that I also got to know a lot of community-based enterprises whose livelihoods actually depend on the ecosystems that our conservation colleagues are trying to protect, right? So I won't go too much into it. I think there will be more questions coming in, so this was ending here for now.
Thank you, Fatin. WWF has been really important catalyst in a lot of the policy and finance work in this part of the world. Perhaps a lot more in Singapore, but it's really heartening to see it growing in Malaysia as well. I think the work you do advising the Ministry of Finance, the central bank on some of the taxonomies, for example, really critical. But also I understand that the ecological fiscal transfer, WWF was very instrumental in that work, and we give credit where it's due. And we would love to hear a little bit more about how EFTs at least has progressed in country, what are the challenges, and perhaps what are the outcomes and what we expect to see. But perhaps, Xiaolong, we were just briefly discussing how long you've been in this sector. COP5 is a long time ago. So the work you do in data and policy, I think that filling in that gap and where financing could actually provide support for that work as we move towards just energy transition.
Thanks, Karen, for outing my age. Morning, yeah, so thinking back 22 years ago, when I was a younger, thinner, longer haired, and a bit angrier man, I was part of a group that drafted what became known as the Bali Principles of Climate Justice. It was one of the first written statements of setting out principles of climate justice. And we had an international drafting committee, people from North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia. We missed out on Antarctica for obvious reasons. And I took a fresh look at the draft this morning, and I think it still stands. Because it emphasizes fundamentally, it connects everything from the global science, climate change, down to the rights of communities, and the need for change to be just and inclusive. And reflecting back on what was also shared this morning from the policymakers and from the financial community, I think there still remains a lot of relevance for Malaysia's way forward. And there is a trilemma that Malaysians have to address with this. So we have this push for greater ambition in terms of our climate targets. We have this constraint in terms of limited financial resources. And then we have to reconcile that somehow with climate justice, or how we as Malaysians understand climate justice both domestically as well as internationally. Because I think as Mina said, we have a very small contribution to global warming. It's a contribution nonetheless, but it's very, very small. historically we're responsible for about 0.37% of emissions, carbon emissions. The US takes the cake, that's 25%, all by itself. And there are just 5 countries which are responsible for 55% of emissions. So we are one of the minor league, but we of course have great potential. At the same time, I think a lot of the discussion has been about emissions and very little about climate adaptation because we're going to be on the receiving end. How many of you here are from the financial industry?
India, America.
You raise your hands. Makes sense.
European Union.
Okay. Maybe you didn't have enough coffee.
And they ever denied it on treaty.
Okay. Anybody here from insurance? Okay. Well done to you guys. So you guys probably know that climate's a big insurance problem, right? So there's a report from the Swiss Re Institute recently. They tried to model or project the damages that would happen to the ASEAN economy, Malaysia particularly, by I think around 2040, 2050. And they're looking at a hit of about 42% loss to GDP. And Malaysia is quite close to the ASEAN average. And those can be from physical impacts. It's not really transition risk that the financial institutions worry about. It's physical impacts. And we're already feeling the physical impacts because we're right in the middle of a heat wave. I know it's very cold here, but it's really hot outside. People are actually coming in with medical conditions as a result. The other climate impact that we're most familiar with is floods. But there's one impact that even if we get our emissions down to net zero, everybody else does the right thing, gets down to net zero, and we stabilize the world at 1.5 degrees average warming, there's one impact that's going to be locked in for 1,000 years, at least, and that's sea level rise. We don't have a plan for sea level rise. Malaysia is primarily a coastal country. 70% of our population live in coastal areas. Some of us also live on islands. What is going to happen? And now here's the climate justice problem. If we don't have enough climate finance to cover our adaptation needs, somebody, most likely in Putrajaya, is going to sit down at the end of the day with some form, hopefully with a cost-benefit analysis, or maybe they'll just make a quick decision by looking at the map. Who is going to have an intervention to keep them afloat, and who is going to sink? Which community is going to be, or part of Malaysia, is going to be considered not financially viable for an intervention on climate adaptation? I hope it doesn't happen, but I fear that that will be a decision taken because we're a developing country. We may be on the cusp of high income, but basically we're just getting our toes through the door, right? We're not comfortably wealthy in the way some other countries are. We still have a lot of poverty and inequality that we have to bridge. And we have great inequality even at the local government level, right? NBPJ, the Dining Jaya Council, is one of the richest councils in the world, right? But that's because the population that it services is very wealthy, right? Can you say the same for, the local council in Kota Baru or in parts of Sabah? They will not have the same resources to make interventions, right? And adaptation interventions need to be made at the local level. They need to be made in consultation with local communities. If someone decides in Putrajaya, I'm not knocking Putrajaya for the sake of it, but you can't make effective adaptation decisions just in Putrajaya for the rest of the country because it has to be devolved. And we've had some discussion with the German government on their experience as well. Korean government even, they actually have a law that mandates that adaptation is the responsibility of local government. We're not there yet. We've got some draft Climate Change Act coming, but it doesn't discuss any of this stuff as far as I know. It's all focused on mitigation. But if you do all the mitigation in Malaysia, which is only responsible for 0.37%, we have to wait around for the US, EU, Russia, China, Japan, Britain, and the other big emitters to get their act together and really cut emissions dramatically for the climate to stabilize at 1.5 degrees centigrade. We can do our bit to get to zero, we can be as ambitious as we want, but the outcome of climate change is actually almost entirely externally dependent, right? Technical word that economists like to use is exogenous. But it's down to us to do what we can to mitigate the physical impacts that happen to us. And those physical impacts, I think we can learn a lot actually from our neighbors in the Philippines or even Bangladesh about physical impact, because they have upgraded a lot. Bangladesh used to be vulnerable to natural disasters, typhoons and all that all the time. Then they put in an early warning system, and now they're much less vulnerable. Philippines, their climate law is actually about institutional chain of command and responsibility for climate adaptation. Who reports to who? We don't have any of that discussion happening right now in Malaysia. We're very much focused on emissions. That's fine, that's well and good. We made commitments in that, we need to make good on that. At the same time, our government has a responsibility to the rakyat, the citizens, to protect them. And protection, national security also involves climate security. Climate security ultimately involves dialogue, inclusion, debate. So part of the concept of justice is also procedural justice. Who gets access to discussions? And I was mentioning earlier, sometimes a policy consultation is called for in Putrajaya with 2 days notice. I can get there because I live in KL. It's easy. I can grab it. Bani in Sabah, he's got a hustle over here. And then people who live in coastal communities, maritime communities, often don't show up. They're not present in the room because they don't have the sufficient notice and sufficient resources to get there to make their case for it. And one of the sad facts of climate impacts is going to be that between 99% to 100% of coral reefs are going to be wiped out at 1.5 degrees centigrade. The science says either 99 or 100. It's bad either way. And coral reefs are crucial for fishing communities. So what is going to happen to our fishing communities? Fish protein is a major part of our diet. It's a major part of the diet for the poor. Right? Because you can just go out and get it. It's not the same as catching chickens. So these are issues of socioeconomic justice that strike us when we're dealing with climate adaptation, because we have to understand success in the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees actually means a lot of impacts, a lot of harsh, terrible impacts that the brunt of which will be borne by the poorest in society, those who are already denied justice and inclusion. So in order to reduce the level of marginalization, we actually have to work harder to change our society, to be more inclusive, and also mobilize the financial resources, like United Climate Finance, that get there. I'll stop now. Right.
Thank you, Shalom. I think aside from the tokenism and the risk of tokenism and representation is something worth discussing, but also the idea around how much information we actually have to be able to channel financing where it's needed. So kind of focusing it back, we have 25 minutes that includes the Q&A. So I think I'm going to bundle the questions that we discussed that we will speak about to maybe speak briefly, maybe 5 minutes each at max, to talk about how you are currently financing the work you do. I remember at COP14, a lot of the work we were doing was around getting access to even the room. In fact, COP14, I remember submitting a consulting paper together with other young people around the world for us to be in the room, to be part of the discussion as an observer community. And in COP15 was the first time that young people were actually represented. So we've actually come some way. And could you say a little bit about how civil society and other groups, Nina, in doing that work, perhaps also speaking about where you're currently getting that financing, how you're using that financing, the gaps in that financing, and what are the solutions that we're looking at in terms of unlocking this financing for the work that you do?
Maybe I'll be a bad person